Day my data pipeline went live and generated $2.3 million in its first quarter, my father opened a bottle of Scotch he'd been saving for 20 years. He poured 2 glasses, one for himself, one for my brother. I stood in the doorway of his home office, watching him do it, still holding my laptop, still wearing the hoodie I'd been in for 36 hours straight. My father looked up, saw me, and said, "We should get you something nice. A gift card, maybe. You deserve a thank you. A thank you. A thank you." Like I'd helped cater an event. I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. That was 18 months before everything collapsed, before my brother called me from a conference room, voice tight and unfamiliar, asking if we could work something out. Before I learned what it felt like to watch someone beg after they'd already made their choice. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the part that matters. I'm a data engineer. Have been since I was 24, which is when I took a junior role at a logistics startup in Austin and realized pretty quickly that I was better at this than most people twice my age. I have a specific kind of brain, the kind that sees patterns in noise, that gets genuinely excited about infrastructure problems, that stays up until 2 in the morning, not because a deadline is looming, but because a solution is almost there and walking away from it feels physically wrong. My college roommate used to say I was pathologically curious. She meant it as a compliment, I think. My father started Whitmore Distribution the year I was born. Regional freight, mostly. Moving goods for mid-size manufacturers across the Southwest. It was a solid, unglamorous business that paid for my childhood in a suburb of San Antonio. Good schools, a used car at 16, college without loans. I was grateful for that. I still am. My brother, 3 years older than me, my father's obvious favorite, not even in a subtle way, joined the company straight out of college. Finance degree from Texas A&M, a firm handshake, a talent for schmoozing clients at golf outings. My father adored him. My mother adored him. He had the right kind of energy for a room full of middle-aged freight brokers. Confident. Loud. Comfortable taking credit. I came back to San Antonio at 28 after my Austin startup was acquired, and I found myself restless and, honestly, a little lonely. My mother had been asking for 2 years when I was coming home. So I came home. My father offered me a position at Whitmore, and I took it, thinking it might be good for a year or 2. Thinking I could help. What I found when I got inside the operation was a mess held together by habit. The company was running on a patchwork of outdated software, manual spreadsheets, gut-feeling decisions about routing and inventory. My father had been doing things the same way for 25 years, and it had worked, sort of. But the margins were shrinking, and he couldn't figure out why. I could see why in about 2 weeks. The inefficiency was everywhere. I didn't say anything right away. I spent 3 months just watching, learning the business, talking to the dispatchers and the warehouse managers, understanding what actually happened on the ground versus what my brother reported in his weekly summaries, which were optimistic in a way that didn't match reality. I built a picture, then I built a model. The model was called Root Core. I named it that because I am, at heart, a nerd with no marketing instincts. And my brother was always the one who made things sound good. Root Core was essentially a predictive logistics engine. It analyzed our historical shipment data, weather patterns, fuel prices, client demand cycles, carrier performance, and about 40 other variables, and it optimized our routing decisions in real time. It could cut our operational costs by an estimated 18% and improve on-time delivery by 22%. Those weren't guesses. I had the numbers. I presented it to my father on a Tuesday morning. He looked at my slides for about 4 minutes, nodded slowly, and said, "Run it by your brother. If he thinks it's worth it, go ahead." My brother thought it was worth it. Specifically, he thought it was worth presenting to our biggest client, a manufacturing company based in Dallas, as a major strategic initiative. His initiative. He was on the phone with their VP of operations before I'd even finished the documentation. I remember sitting across from him in the conference room after that call, watching him grin and thinking, he's going to take this from me. It wasn't paranoia. It was just a very clear-eyed read of a pattern I'd been watching my whole life. My brother had a gift for showing up at the moment. Something became valuable and positioning himself as the reason it existed. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was the work. I just wanted to see it run. Root Core launched in the spring. By summer, Whitmore's operational costs were down 21%, better than my projection. On-time delivery hit 94%, up from 78%. The Dallas client signed a contract extension worth 3 times their previous annual spend. My father called it a turning point for the company. He said my brother had modernized the operation. My brother gave a speech at the company's anniversary dinner that June. He talked about vision. He talked about lision. He talked about leadership. He talked about the future of Whitmore distribution. He said we built something special this year, and looked around the room at the team, and I was part of the team, so technically I was included, but the way he said it made clear that we meant him and the company and the legacy, and my actual contribution was roughly equivalent to any of the 12 dispatchers in the room. I smiled through the whole speech. I ate my chicken. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for a long time, not crying, just staring at the steering wheel, trying to figure out what exactly I was feeling. The word for it, I think, was invisible. The next 6 months were fine, on the surface. I kept developing root core. There were always improvements to make, new data to incorporate, bugs to fix. My father gave me a raise in September, a real one, which surprised me. He said the numbers spoke for themselves. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd gotten, and I held on to it maybe more than I should have. What I didn't know was that in October, my father and brother started meeting privately about the company's future. Succession planning. My brother was being positioned as CEO when my father eventually stepped back, which was reasonable, I told myself. He'd been there longer, he knew the client relationships, he had the title. What I found out later, from our company attorney who I'd always been friendly with, was that the plan also included a full restructuring of how intellectual property and proprietary systems were attributed within the company. Rootcore was going to be rebranded as a Whitmore Company asset, developed under my brother's leadership. Not mine. His. Our attorney told me this over coffee in early November, in a carefully worded way that gave her plausible deniability, but was unmistakably a warning. She slid a folder toward me across the table. You should look at your original employment agreement, she said, and you should talk to someone. I went home and read my employment agreement for the first time since I'd signed it 2 years earlier, in a rush, on a Tuesday afternoon, because my father had handed it to me and said standard stuff, and I'd trusted him. It was not entirely standard stuff. There was a clause. Broad intellectual property assignment. Anything developed during the course of my employment, using company resources, belonged to Whitmore Distribution. Rootcore, which I had built on company time on a company laptop, was legally the company's property. I had no individual claim to it. Technically, neither did my brother, but the restructuring would put it under his division's umbrella in a way that effectively gave him ownership of its legacy. I read that clause 4 times. Then I closed my laptop and went for a 2-hour walk. Here's what I knew. I had built the only thing in that company that was genuinely new. The freight brokerage side of the business was a commodity. There were 100 companies doing what Whitmore did, and the only edge we had now was Rootcore. Without it, we were running a slightly above-average regional operation with aging client relationships and no particular reason for a customer to choose us over a competitor. With it, we had a product that was genuinely difficult to replicate, one that was already generating interest from other companies in the industry. 2 freight companies in Houston had reached out to my father, asking if Whitmore would consider licensing the technology. My brother had told my father to decline those inquiries. He wanted to keep it proprietary. What my brother did not know, what no one at Whitmore knew because I had never mentioned it, was that the core algorithm I'd built Rootcore on top of was developed before I joined the company. In the last 3 months of my time in Austin, I had been building a personal project on nights and weekends, a routing optimization framework I called Meridian. Meridian never became a product. The startup got acquired before I could do anything with it, and in the chaos of the acquisition, I just shelved it. But the fundamental architecture of Rootcore, the actual predictive engine, the pattern-matching logic at the core of everything was Meridian, adapted and scaled up. I had timestamps, I had version histories, I had a GitHub repository I'd never made public, sitting quietly in my personal account, with 2 years of commit history predating my employment at Whitmore. I also had a lawyer. I hired one in November, a week after that coffee meeting. A woman named Nothing You Need to Know who handled IP litigation and had a reputation for being thorough and not particularly sentimental. I told her everything. She spent 2 weeks reviewing my records. Then she called me and said in her perfectly neutral voice, "You have a strong position." I went back to work. I said nothing. I kept improving Rootcore, kept showing up to meetings, kept sending weekly reports. My brother announced at Thanksgiving dinner that he was going to be named President of Operations in January. My parents raised their glasses. My mother said she was so proud. I raised my glass too. I smiled. I said congratulations. He looked at me across the table and said, "We're going to need you to keep running the tech side. You're good at that." "I know I am," I said. He thought I was agreeing with him. January came. My brother's new title was announced internally. Then, the week after the announcement, my father asked me to come to a dinner. Not at a restaurant, at the house. Sunday night. He said it was a family dinner, just the four of us. I knew it wasn't just dinner. I drove to my parents' house that Sunday knowing what was probably coming. My father had a way of doing hard things over food. It was his version of a controlled environment, the table as a kind of formality that kept things civil. I'd watched him fire a longtime employee that way once, over lunch at a Tex-Mex place on the north side. Never raised his voice, never let it get messy. My mother had made pot roast, the good kind, the one that takes all day. She hugged me at the door, took my jacket, asked how I was sleeping. "Fine," I said. She didn't look like she believed me. We ate. The conversation was normal for 20 minutes. My father's golf game, my mother's book club, my brother's new house. He was remodeling in Alamo Heights. Then my father set down his fork. "I want to talk about where things are going," he said. I put my fork down too. He talked for about 5 minutes. He used words like structure and focus and long-term vision. What he meant was this: the company was moving in a direction that required clarity of leadership. My brother was that leader. My role, and he said this carefully, choosing each word, needed to evolve. He thought it might make sense for me to consider transitioning out of my current position and into a consulting capacity. External. Project-based. Meaning what exactly? I said. My brother, who had been very quiet, said, "Meaning your contract wouldn't be renewed in March, but we'd want to keep you on for specific projects. Compensation would be fair." I looked at my father. "You're letting me go." "We're restructuring," my father said. My mother was looking at her plate. "And Root Core," I said. "What happens to Root Core?" "Root Core is a company asset," my brother said. "That's in your employment agreement, but we'd make sure you're acknowledged. We can build something into the consulting arrangement that recognizes your contribution to developing it." He said contribution to developing like I had helped. Like I had been one of several people who worked on something together. I sat there for a moment. The pot roast was getting cold. "I need you both to hear me clearly," I said. "The reason I'm saying what I'm about to say isn't out of anger. It's because I think you genuinely don't understand what you're dealing with." My father frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means Root Core is not entirely what you think it is. The core engine, the piece that makes everything work, is based on a framework I developed before I ever worked at Whitmore. Before I ever signed that employment agreement. I have documentation going back 3 years. I have a lawyer who has reviewed all of it, and her assessment is that I have a strong intellectual property claim to the architecture that Root Core is built on." The room went very quiet. My brother said, "You can't." "I'm not threatening anything tonight," I said. "I'm informing you. Because if you proceed with this restructuring without taking that into account, you will be making a decision without full information. And I think that would be bad for everyone." My father was very still. He had a way of going still when he was calculating something, when his brain was working through scenarios. I had inherited that from him, actually. It was maybe the most useful thing he'd given me. "What is it you want?" he said finally. "Tonight?" "Nothing. I want you to think about what I just told you. I want you to talk to your attorney. Not the one who's been in this family's pocket for 20 years. A different one, and get a real assessment. Then I'd like to have a different conversation." I picked up my fork and finished my pot roast. My mother got up and poured everyone more water. The rest of the dinner was very quiet. I drove home that night with my hands steady on the wheel. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I felt something that I can only describe as a very deep calm. The kind that comes not from certainty about outcomes, but from knowing that you finally told the truth out loud and it cannot be taken back. My father called a lawyer the next day. Not the family one. I know because that lawyer called my lawyer, which is how these things work. For 3 weeks, nothing happened publicly. Internally, I assumed a great deal was happening. My brother emailed me twice, professional, carefully worded emails asking to schedule a call. I responded briefly, "I'm available. Let me know when you've had a chance to review everything." He didn't schedule the call. I went to work. I kept my head down. I documented everything. In early February, my father asked to meet me for lunch, just the two of us, at a diner near his office that he'd been going to for 30 years. We sat in the corner booth and he ordered the same thing he always ordered. Turkey club, no chips, coffee. And he looked at me across the table for a long moment before he said anything. I owe you an apology, he said. I didn't say anything. I waited. I've been telling your brother his whole life that he had what it took to run this company. And he does. He's good with people. He's good with clients. He understands the business side. I believed in that so much that I stopped looking at what else was happening. Who else was contributing? He paused. That wasn't fair to you. No, I said. It wasn't. The lawyers are telling me we have a problem with the IP. He said problem the way my father always said hard things. Neutrally, like a weather report. I know, I said. What would it take to fix it? I had thought about this for a long time. I had run the numbers, talked to my lawyer, thought about what I actually wanted. Not what would feel satisfying in the moment, but what I actually wanted my life to look like. I want a licensing agreement, I said. Whitmore can continue using the Meridian architecture in root core. I'll formalize that through my own LLC. Whitmore pays a licensing fee. My lawyer has a number. It's reasonable. I keep the rights to develop it independently. And I want proper attribution, not in a press release, in the actual company documentation, the tech stack records, the client-facing materials. My father nodded slowly. And your brother? That's between you and him, I said. I'm not asking you to do anything about that. I'm asking you to recognize what I built. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You got my stubbornness. I know, I said. I'm sorry it took this long for me to see you. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't entirely okay, and he wouldn't have believed me anyway. He raised me to be honest. So I just said, I know, Dad. We ate our lunch. He paid. He hugged me at the door in a way that felt different from how he usually hugged me. Tighter. A little longer. I drove back to my apartment and sat at my desk and cried for about 45 minutes. The hard kind of crying that doesn't feel like relief so much as release. Like something that had been stored under pressure, finally just gave way. The licensing agreement was signed in March. The LLC I'd formed, I named it Meridian Analytics, because sometimes the honest name is the right name, had its first revenue before my Whitmore contract technically ended. I'd been quiet about my work, but I had been paying attention to those Houston companies who'd asked about licensing the technology. I reached out. I took meetings. By April, I had 2 clients. My brother called me in late March. I answered this time. He said he thought we should clear the air. He said some things about how the situation had gotten complicated, and he'd been caught in the middle of competing pressures, and he hoped I knew that his intention was never to cut me out. I listened to the whole thing. When he finished, I said, I appreciate that. I hope things go well for you. He paused. That's all you're going to say? What else is there to say? I thought maybe we could. I don't have any anger toward you, I said, and meant it. But I also don't have a lot of energy for this conversation. I have work to do. There was a silence on the line. Then he said quietly, You always were the one who did the work. Yeah, I said. I know. I ended the call and went back to my laptop. By summer, Meridian Analytics had 4 clients and 2 employees. I had moved out of my apartment into a place I actually liked, with a real desk and enough room for a second monitor and a window that got morning light. I worked a lot, but I worked in a way that felt like mine. No one to explain myself to, no approval to wait for, no speech to sit through at a company dinner. My mother texted me every Sunday. We had gotten into the habit of long phone calls on Sunday afternoons, just the 2 of us, while she walked in the neighborhood. She didn't talk about the business. She talked about her book club, her garden, a documentary she'd watched. Slowly, carefully, we were building something back. My father came to my office in July. He asked for a tour, which was funny because the office was 800 square feet and the tour took 3 minutes. He looked at everything carefully. The whiteboard covered in system diagrams, the 2 monitors, the small plant on the windowsill I'd bought because I read that plants reduce stress and I was, at the time, a little stressed. He stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the parking lot. It's a good space, he said. I like it, I said. He turned around. The Dallas client renewed again. The VP told me Rootcore is the main reason they stay with us. Just so you know. That's good, I said. I'm glad it's still working for you. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else. Then he just nodded again and said, "Take care of yourself." After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time. I thought about who I had been when I came back to San Antonio. Restless, a little lonely, wanting something without knowing what it was. I thought about the version of me who had stood in a doorway watching my father pour 2 glasses of scotch and told myself it didn't matter. It mattered. It always mattered. I just hadn't known then that I was allowed to say so. I opened my laptop. I had a client call in 20 minutes and a new module to finish by Thursday. My calendar was full. My work was mine. I thought about my brother's voice on the phone. "You always were the one who did the work." And I felt something settle in my chest, something quiet and solid that I recognized, after a moment, as being enough. I pulled up my code. I got back to it. There's a version of this story where I walk away angry, where I spend months replaying that dinner, the pot roast going cold, my father's careful words, my brother's face across the table, where the anger is the fuel. But that's not actually how it went. What I've thought about most, looking back, isn't the betrayal itself. It's how long I let the conditions for it exist. I came back to San Antonio wanting to contribute, wanting to be seen. And when I wasn't seen, I told myself it didn't matter. I bit my tongue at dinners. I watched my brother give speeches about work I had done, and I smiled and ate my chicken, and I filed it away as something I could live with. That was its own kind of failure. Not a moral one, but a practical one. When you consistently accept less than what's true, you train the people around you to believe that's all you require. The honest thing is that what saved me wasn't anger, and it wasn't luck. It was that I had kept building. All those nights working on Meridian before anyone cared about it, before it had a name that meant anything, before a single person was paying attention. That work existed independently of whether my father noticed it, or my brother took credit for the version that came after. The foundation was mine because I had laid it in the dark, for no reason except that the problem was interesting and I wanted to solve it. That kind of work doesn't disappear when someone tries to take the surface of it. It sits underneath, time-stamped, documented, waiting. I've thought about what it actually takes to come through something like this without losing yourself. What I keep landing on is that it's not one thing. It's 3 things that have to work together. There's doing the right thing even when no one is watching, which sounds simple, but is genuinely hard when the people you love are giving the credit to someone else. And you could easily stop trying so hard. There's being smart enough to understand what you actually have and what it's worth. Not in an arrogant way, but in a clear-eyed way. The way you'd read a contract or review your own commit history at 2 a.m. And there's staying in the work long enough for the truth to surface, which is its own kind of endurance. Not toughness in the dramatic sense, just not quitting. My father came to my office in July. He stood at the window, looked at the whiteboard, looked at the little plant I'd bought because I read plants reduce stress. He said it was a good space. That was all he said, and it was enough, because we both understood what the space meant. My brother said on that last phone call that I was always the one who did the work. He meant it as a kind of concession, I think. Maybe an apology. I received it as something simpler, confirmation of something I already knew. I didn't need him to say it to believe it, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't matter at all. What I know now is that the work was always going to outlast the politics of who got to stand next to it. Cause and effect are patient. The foundation holds or it doesn't. I built mine carefully, in the years before anyone was paying attention, and when it mattered, it was still there. I pulled up my code. I got back to it.